I knew about Jacques Monod first because of the beautiful biology that he had accomplished, particularly with his collaborator, Francois Jacob. And you learn that as a biology student, the fundamentals of gene regulation, how genes are turned on and off. They did the pioneering work in bacteria in a series of studies over the 1950s and very early 1960s that really became a foundation in molecular biology. But, I read somewhere that Jacques Monod was in the French Resistance during World War II, and that at some point in his life he was friends with Albert Camus. And I wanted to know more, but I really only could get like sentence long descriptions of this. And I kind of held that thought for 30 years. I happened to have an exposure to French literature in college, a deep exposure to French literature in college while also studying biology. So I had just some interest in these figures. And I thought, okay, if am I ever going to get the chance, can I find a way to figure out, well, exactly what was this relationship between Monod and Camus? So I'm telling you how I got into it for a second, just to say that's exactly the question. What you just asked me was a question I had around 2010. Maybe I had a question I probably had for decades before that, but right around 2010, I thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can get anywhere on this story. If I can find some original material, maybe I can dig into it and illuminate something about their friendship. And then again, through all sorts of chance encounters and lucky moments and things like that, all sorts of materials came to me from people who knew Jacques Monod in particular personally, or who were close to him, including family members. But that also turned up a bunch of materials on Camus, in fact, materials that were in Monod's possession. And so important to know that, so both men were in the French Resistance. They were in different resistance groups during World War II. And I have no evidence they could have encountered each other, but they would have been using aliases. So I don't have any evidence that they met during World War II. But upon the liberation of France, this was this huge relief and joy of after 4 years of German occupation. There was a lot of getting together of members of the resistance and of thinking about the future of France. And Monod was dealing with some issues. His only really public pronouncements, or he wrote something for a French newspaper about what was a beginning controversy at the time, which was coming out of the Soviet Union, and that had to do with biology and someone that Stalin had essentially put in charge of biology, as a character named Lysenko. And Monod wrote a really detailed, damning critique of Lysenko, who did really essentially take down Soviet biology, sort of built it all on mythology and false information. And Camus was having the same concerns about the communist movement out of the Soviet Union, which had a lot of influence in France, particularly on the political left. So while Camus was working on a book that was going to be sort of an expose of the failures of Soviet-style communism, he hears about and then meets this scientist who has his own critiques of what Soviet Union was doing to science. And they hit it off because they had just experienced the crushing rule of Nazi Germany, built on mythology and on this supposedly infallible leader. And they saw the Soviet Union as having really the same makeup, that it was just a replay of what they'd experienced during World War II. So they really joined forces to speak out against Soviet-style communism in France. And that mattered a lot because the Communist Party was very popular in France at the end of World War II. The communists had led really the resistance movement, particularly the armed resistance movement in France. And there was a lot of, and Soviet Union and what came out of Moscow had a lot of influence in France. But now voices like Camus and Monnot were speaking up and saying, wait, this is nonsense. What's being said about history or what's being said about science, this is nonsense. It's this authoritarian, totalitarian type state, and they needed to send that alarm through society. Camus had a tremendous platform. He was anonymously widely read during the resistance, and then when it became clear who he was, once France was liberated, he was a national hero. And Monnot was a friend, and they met, and I have lots of evidence of their meetings and correspondence and things like this. But it's quite clear that in their writing, Monnot gave Camus some valuable information in a book he wrote called L'Homme Révolté, or The Rebel, which was his expose of the Soviet Union. There's a section in there on science, which I know from, in fact, unpublished stuff from Monnot was Camus was the beneficiary of Monnot's insights. But I can see Camusian thought all through Monnot's writing. And in fact, Monnot's book, Chance and Necessity, opens with a segment. The epigraph is a segment from Camus' book, The Myth of Sisyphus. So these two men had a very warm, very mutually, they were certainly mutual admirers. In fact, I got a quote from someone that Camus once said that he's only met one true genius, and that was Jacques Monnot. So, yeah, it was a really, for each of them, I think, a very important friendship, because Camus was losing his friends on the political left, most famously Jean-Paul Sartre, but he was gaining new friends like Monnot, who were more, who were rock solid, sort of empirically, right? They were not just armchair philosophers. They were, Monnot had a great scientific foundation. And then Monnot, who was really interested in sort of the philosophical dimensions of science, has Camus as a conversation partner in the cafes of Paris. So I think this was just a kind of a beautiful friendship that served them from post-war period to 1960, when Camus died tragically in a car accident. Even then, Camus' influence was clearly beyond that time. In fact, you could argue for a little while that maybe Monnot almost took Camus' place a little bit as a public person in France. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1965, the newspaper, it is the first time France had swept the Nobels, I think, in decades. And Monnot was really well prepared to become a public figure. He was incredibly articulate. He was bilingual. His mother was American, so he knew English very well. So he did very well with the British press, the American press. He was a very charismatic person, very thoughtful person. And so he, for example, when Martin Luther King came to Paris in 1966, it was Monnot who introduced King to Paris. Big event, that sort of thing. So Monnot was very concerned with civil rights. He was very concerned with women's reproductive rights. He was very concerned with student rights. He was deeply involved in the riots of 1968, when there were huge riots and rebellion in the French universities, and Monnot was sort of a go-between between the students and the government, so much so that people encouraged him to run for president of France. So that's a little bit on Monnot, but to study those characters and to see how Camus, who was, he was a novelist and a newspaper man, but it was the circumstances of World War II that, by accident, and he easily could have been caught and deported. He had some close calls. he winds up being almost the conscience of France. You know, the and his editorials are so inspiring and so exhilarating still to read, you know, 80 years later. So he just found himself going from, you know, an obscure, you know, philosopher writer to an international figure in a short period of time. And Monod, who was studying phenomena in bacteria that probably only 20 people in the world had ever heard of, winds up discovering fundamental secrets of life that, for example, it certainly gave birth to the capability to do genetic engineering and things like this. But he was interested in bigger issues, philosophical issues, and that's what's evidenced by his writings like Chance and Necessity. So, again, much like Darwin and Wallace and all sorts of people, it's just really enriching to delve into these lives. And I didn't, you know, for example, nothing. It was you wouldn't talk about what you did in the French Resistance. You know, it would post-war. It would seem, I don't know, boastful or something like that. I think when resistance got together, they could share stories because they had been through it. But Monod didn't really talk about what he did in the French Resistance. I had to reconstruct that from, in fact, people who worked with him in the French Resistance, and you know, from all sorts of documents and letters he wrote. You know, so you know, part of my admiration for Monod is that when his country, when its existence was threatened, you know, he put his life on the line. He went underground and he worked for the resistance and he wore a disguise and wound up being one of the major officers in Paris at the time of the liberation of the city. And those experiences certainly shaped his or reinforced the principles that he held. And so anytime he saw, I mean, he was reacting to the situation in the Soviet Union, but I think anytime he saw, you know, power overwhelming individuals' rights and individual freedom, and or power overwhelming scientific truth, he spoke up. So I think it's a very relevant set of values around the globe today.